Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Okay, thanks for coming, everyone. I think we're competing with the good weather, but just a quick thing before we start. In April, we usually do one a month, but in April we're going to have two, so if you can make it, please come by. On Friday, April 20th, we're going to hear about a book called The Science and Fiction of Autism by Laura Schriebman. Our reviewer is going to be Rich Vassy. He works at the Albany Center for Disability Services. He's also on the radio, WQBK. And on Thursday, April 26th, Sheila Otto, she works at she's a professor at Albany Medical College and the Alden March Bioethics Institute. She's going to review a book called Last Rites, Rescuing the End of Life from the Medical System. Sheila was here a couple years ago and gave a really great review, so please come if you can be here. Now today, we're going to hear about food. So. Cynthia Nicholson is going to review our book, Heat. I think the subtitle says it all, if you know Mario on TV. An amateur's adventures as a kitchen slave, line cook, pasta maker, and apprentice to a Dante-Quoting butcher in Tuscany. That's the subtitle. Now, Cynthia has, if you read our little flyer and newsletter, she's worked for a lot of food magazines. She's been a food editor, a recipe developer, a food stylist. I originally had food styler, but she said, no, it's food stylist. So I made the change, but I still don't know what that is. But and she's now heard there's some flyers in the back if you guys are interested. She also runs a little business called the Farmhouse Table, I guess it's called. She leads tours of Sicily, and if you want to go, you can talk to her afterwards. There's little descriptions back there. Oops. She's also going to be doing a little trip to Montreal in August. So I guess she brings you around and, it's a culinary tour, so she'll tell you all about that. But now we're going to hear about this book, Heat. So here's Cynthia to tell us about it. Oh, there she is.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you all for coming today. I really had no idea how many people would show up. But obviously there are some people around Albany that are interested in food and interested in this writer, Bill Buford. Can I ask how many people have read the book, Heat? Okay, so less than half. How many people here consider themselves foodies? Good number of folks. Okay, yes, me too. I consider myself a foodie. This book, Bill Buford, it's so beautifully written. He is a former fiction editor of The New Yorker, of the magazine The New Yorker. And when I first started reading the book and started thinking about what he actually did, I mean, here he was, a fiction editor at probably one of the most prestigious magazines in this country as far as writing goes. And then he just kind of decides, you know what, I want to go cook in a kitchen, and he kind of, the way he describes it in the book is that he had been doing this for 23 years, been sitting behind a desk for 23 years, and he decided he wanted to go and work in this fast-paced, high-pressure, big-time, big-name, big-city kitchen, Babbo, which is, of course, one of the crown jewels of the Mario Batali restaurant empire. Has anyone ever been to Babbo? Okay. I have been to Poe when he was actually when he was not famous yet. Has anyone been to Poe? Was anyone at Poe before he became a star on the Food Network or anything like that? No? Okay. Well, I was actually in culinary school in New York City. This was in 1994. And I believe he started appearing on Molto Mario in 1996 on the Food Network. Anyway, he is, and I actually had enough gumption to go back in the kitchen and talk to this man while he was cooking. And you all probably know what Mario Batali looks like. He's rather large, rotund, red hair, ponytail, usually wears shorts and clogs, usually wildly colored clogs, and has a reputation of being a wild man. In the food world in New York City, he is considered kind of like, this, party animal type person. So at the time, I was so ignorant, about these things. I was in culinary school. I did not go to culinary school until I was 39 years old. I was self-taught for many, many years, and one day realized that I should probably go to culinary school. I'd been making my living in food in various ways for about 6 or 7 years, and this was kind of like my third career at this point. Anyway, I'm in culinary school, and a friend of mine in New York City who owned a restaurant had told me about this little restaurant down in the village called Poe that was kind of like rocking the food world in New York City. And I said, well, what kind of food is it? And he goes, well, it's Northern Italian. And I'm like, Northern Italian? What is that? What is Northern Italian food? So it was a tiny place. It's on Cornelia Street. It's in the West Village. And a couple of friends of mine from my class in culinary school decided we were going to go check it out. And so we did, and it was a revelation. And I had actually been to Italy at this point in my life. I had been cooking on a yacht. Now, that's another story. But I had actually crossed the Atlantic and worked in the Mediterranean for a season on this Welsh yacht. I was the only American crew member. And we were based near Nice, and we mainly did charters around the Italian Riviera and the French Riviera. So the first time I ever stepped foot in Italy was actually stepping off a boat onto shore, and the very first thing I had was a huge serving of gelato. And that was kind of when my love affair with Italy started, was that first taste of gelato. I'd never tasted anything like it before in my life. But anyway, Mario Batali, I'm finally going to culinary school, and I go to this little restaurant called Poe. Pardon me. And I said, I've got to go talk to this chef. I've got to go find out, because a lot of people that go to culinary school, after they are done, then they go and do kind of an apprenticeship in France or Italy, or some people decide to go to California and work in California if they're not brave enough to go to Europe. But anyway, I decided that I was going to go talk to this man, and I go and I kind of peek into the kitchen door, and he's standing there, and he looked like an octopus. I mean, he was moving, his arms were flailing, and he was running around, his ponytail was flying up in the air, and he was the only person in the kitchen. I was so impressed. I was like, oh my God, how's he putting out all this wonderful food? I think he had a dishwasher. And it was just Mario Batali in the kitchen with his purple clogs and his shorts and his ponytail, and and I kind of peeked around and knocked on the door, and I said, hi. I said, can I talk to you for a second? And he goes, sure. He goes, just don't get too close. I said, okay. So I kind of gingerly came into the kitchen door, and I said, I'm a culinary student. I'm in culinary school, and I just wanted to talk to you and, just see your operation back here, because I was so impressed with the food, and he said, well, thank you. And he said, I said, is there any kind of, this is how naive I am. I'm 39 years old, and this is how stupid I was. I said, is there any advice you can give me? As he's trying to put out dinner for 30 tables, all at once. He said, try your best to go and study in Europe. Try to learn the language. That's really the best way for you to learn, is to go to a place and learn about the culture and the food and see how much they are actually intertwined with each other. So I didn't get to do that for a very long time after that, but it always stuck in my head. And he was actually, even though he had this reputation as being a party animal, and as Bill Buford points out in the book, he has some pretty good stories in the book about Mario's hard drinking, late night carousing. He was so kind to me, and it really impressed me that he took the time to talk to this stupid person about her love of food and how she could maybe mold her future. So that's my Mario Batali story, and how Bill Buford came about writing this book. Again, here he is, an editor at the New Yorker, and they want to do a profile of Mario Batali. They want to do a story on Mario Batali, and he can't get anybody kind of interested on staff to assign the story to, so he decides that he's going to take on doing the profile of this chef. Bill Buford is kind of a home cook. He enjoys cooking. He's not an educated cook. He's mainly a cook by the book kind of person. You know what I mean? Like, he follows a recipe to the T. And how many out here do that, or how many? There's two schools. There's follow the recipe to a T, and then there's just use the recipe for inspiration. Okay, I'm one of those. I like that. Yeah. So first of all, I really appreciated Buford's book in the point of view that he is writing the book from a viewpoint of someone who walks into a kitchen and knows, absolutely nothing. I mean, there are few more humbling experiences than working as a low-ranking slave in a restaurant kitchen, because you find out pretty soon how much you don't know. During some of my first experiences as one, I learned that everything I thought I knew was wrong. As to cut up an onion, I was taught, and my mother was a pretty good cook, and I learned a lot from her, but, she taught me how to cut up an onion. Well, that was wrong. I thought I knew how to make like a basic white sauce. Wrong. I thought I knew how to fry fish. I'm from the Gulf Coast, and I grew up watching my mother and my grandmother fry not only fish, but shrimp, hush puppies, all these, southern type deep fried delicious foods. Grew up watching them how to do all that. I didn't know how to do that either after I eventually found out. So Bill Buford tackles the cooking from this same perspective that I had. Walking into a kitchen and not really having any formal training. I mean, as I said earlier, I was self-taught for many, many years. So I appreciate his point of view, and he really does reveal a side of a professional kitchen that is harrowing, is a good word to use. It's very, especially in a kitchen in a 3-star restaurant in New York City. I mean, I cannot even imagine the pressure. But he does a really good job of taking you there and getting you like on the line with him as he's trying to not ruin. He he started out, everyone starts out in the kitchen as a cold station person, or they call it the pantry, and that's making the salads. And then you eventually move around to the different stations, like the grill station, the fry station, and the saute station. And it's like learning a whole new language. It's like learning everything from scratch. Each time you move around to a different station, and sometimes they don't even let you pick up a pot or a pan. I mean, actually cook for probably almost an entire year, sometimes longer. So first you have to prove yourself as a prep cook, learning how to use a knife properly. And that's one thing that Bill Buford does point out in the beginning, is that, I thought I knew how to use a knife, but obviously I don't, because they would end up throwing out half of his 36 pounds of carrots that he had just chopped up, and that's too big. Toss it out, So it was a lesson in humility, and I've been there. I know how that feels. So, anybody in here work in a restaurant or have worked in a restaurant? Aha. Okay. All right. So you know what I'm talking about. Okay. Let's see. Let's move on here. Going back to the fact that he was this editor at this very prestigious national magazine and deciding to become like a workhorse in this kitchen kind of fascinated me. I think right in my mind, the first thing I thought of was that it was probably like a midlife crisis or something. I can't imagine anyone quitting their job. His wife was also a magazine editor, and I think she's mentioned in the book, kind of standing in the background, kind of scratching her head, going, okay, whatever you want to do, and then when he decides, after he's been working at Babot for a year, and he'd already written the article about Mario Batali for the magazine, and then he's kind of like, okay, I'm switching over from being a journalist to a cook. And that's when he decides that he's going to go to Italy. He's going to move to Italy, and he's trying to talk his wife into doing this. She goes, don't you already know how to make tortellini? And he's like, yes, but I have to learn more. I have to learn more. And that's part of the book, too, that's so heartfelt, is that his passion, he realizes he now has this passion about food. He wants to learn more, and he actually starts talking and doing a lot of research in food history. And that's something that I was never really that much aware of until I went to culinary school. And I had to actually take a course in a basic course in food history. And it was something that he peppers throughout the book, is his research into some of these really very old and ancient Italian manuscripts and cookbooks that were written in the 1400s, cookbooks that are descriptions of banquets during the Renaissance. And he's on a quest to find out, when was the first egg used to make fresh pasta rather than water? Because it used to be just water, flour, maybe a pinch of salt, and that was it. And that was how you made pasta for years and years, for millennium, hundreds of years. That's how people made pasta. And then one day, someone decided to try to hydrate the flour with egg rather than water. And he wanted to find out when that exact moment was. When did they start using eggs and making pasta fresca and stop using water? So he goes through this whole exhaustive research on trying to find these ancient cookbooks to find out when was that moment, and how did they who thought of it, and it's actually quite exhaustive. So if you're in at all interested in the history of Italian food especially, you'll find this book very interesting in that he does talk about that quite a bit. And he also talks about different cuts of meat and how ancient they are and how they've probably changed very little from the time of, let's say, the early Renaissance up until now. So that's another part of the book that I found very interesting. He is looked upon in the kitchen at Babot as, they call him the writer guy. And they don't really take him very seriously until he starts, then he finally works his way off the pantry, off the coal station, into the grill station. And he ruins, they had 36 orders of branzino, which is a whole Mediterranean type sea bass. He had 36 orders of branzino in the first night that he was on the grill, and he ruined, I think he said like 22 of them. So, and he gives this wonderful description of the guy who's kind of trying to train him, and he looks like someone who just, wandered in from the bowels of hell. I mean, he's got soot all over his face. He's got, grease and sweat. His chef's jacket has practically melted onto his body. He said after the first night, all the hair on his arms were completely burned off, like in the first hour. He talks about all of the things that can happen to you in a kitchen, that when you're not so familiar with using a knife or a grill or bubbling hot oil. I mean, he cuts himself, he burns himself, and a lot of, most chefs use their fingers to check to see if something is done, a piece of meat, let's say. And he actually ripped open his middle finger, and he had it all bandaged up, and they made him take it off so he could use his finger to tell if the piece of meat was done or not. I mean, it sounds like torture, and it can be. It can be torture. But I think he realized that he was also trying to push himself to explore a part of himself that he had never even knew existed before. So it's kind of a book not only about him finding out about his passion for food and finding out about all of these wonderful things in food history that he never knew before, but he also found out a lot of strengths about himself that he never knew he had before. So I wanted to try to read you a passage in the book. Read you a couple of passages, actually. He is such a wonderful writer. And I think that if you haven't read the book yet, I mean, if you're at all interested in food, if you're at all interested in traveling to Italy, or if you've been to Italy, you'll find the book really fascinating, because he goes and apprentices with some of the people that Mario Batali studied with. And they're just in these little tiny podunk towns that you've never heard of before. But the description of where they are and the food and the passion that these people have, it's just wonderful. So if you like food, if you like Italy, if you like Italian food, you'll love reading this book. I'm just going to read you a little bit about when he is first starting out in the test kitchen. He absolutely, I mean, the description of his humiliation and finding out, first of all, when he shows up to the kitchen on his first day and does not bring any knives with him. They were kind of like, what, are you some idiot? I mean, you're working in a kitchen and you don't bring knives? I mean, what's wrong with you? So I will read you a part after, this is after he'd been there for probably maybe 3 or 4 days. I came to regard the prep kitchen as something like a culinary boot camp, especially during my first weeks, where I was being taught basic techniques of being a cook, especially knife skills. It seemed that I'd been using a knife for years without knowing how to use one. On that first morning, I paused to sharpen my knife. Well, actually, it was Alyssa's knife. And she stopped what she was doing and stared. I was doing it backward. Ergo, I had always been doing it backward. Then there was the rocking thing. The idea is that when you're chopping your food, you want to leave the tip of your knife in place on the cutting board. You end up rocking the knife blade back and forth, and the blade then slides effortlessly and with much more control through whatever you're chopping. Everyone who cooks probably knows this, but I didn't. Some techniques seemed fussy. Carrots were a trauma. Long cooking meat broths have carrots in them, along with celery, onions, and herbs, which soften the meatiness of a meat liquid. This was something I knew, or at least I thought I did. I made broths at home, soups, chicken stock, and that sort of thing, and I'd simply tossed in my carrots, chopped up or not. What did it matter if they were going to cook for hours? Wrong. Evidently, there are only two ways to prepare a carrot: rough cut and fine dice. Rough cut meant slicing the carrot in half lengthwise, then chop, 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 cutting it into perfectly identical half moons, which to my eye had nothing rough about them. The nightmare was fine dice, which meant cutting every bit of the carrot into identical 1 millimeter square cubes. A carrot is not shaped like a cube. And so you first had to trim it up into a long rectangle and then cut it into thin 1 millimeter planks. And then take your 1 millimeter planks and cut them into long 1 millimeter slivers. And then take your perfectly formed slivers and chop, 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 chop. Cut them into 1 millimeter cubes. I seem to have done my first batch almost right. Either that, or it was late and everyone was in a hurry, and no one looked too closely at the geometric mishmash in the container I'd filled. My second batch involved 36 carrots. It took me a long time to cube 36 carrots. Normally, Alyssa popped around to make sure I wasn't mangling what I was working on, but she must have trusted me with the carrots. After all, what can you do to a carrot? So, when she finally looked in, I was almost done. She shrieked, "I said fine dice! This is not fine dice! I don't know what they are, but they're wrong." I had been cutting carrots for over 2 hours. And then, like that, they were tossed. They were that bad. I wanted to weep. It took me 3 days before I could tell anyone about the experience. She threw away my carrots, all of them. And even then, I could hear a quiver of indignation in my voice. It was a month later that I finally succeeded in getting the carrots right. Although the achievement, "Wow," Alyssa said, picking up my 4-quart container and dumping the contents into a braising liquid, "These are good," was secretly marred by my having covertly eaten 700 imperfect little squares. So that gives you an idea of the precision that is called for in a kitchen of this caliber. And Bill Buford goes on. Eventually, he does, as I said, he does move up in the ranks and decides that he is going to quit his job at the New Yorker and stay in the kitchen. I think, too, it says a lot about him as a person, because kitchens normally in high-end restaurants like that are very small and usually underground. So you have to really, really, really want to work in this type of environment. It's not a pleasant environment. You never see the light of day. You're on your feet usually anywhere from 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours. Everybody is pasty looking because nobody ever sees the light of day. You get off of work around 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. Usually you go home, sleep, and get up and go do it again. So it's a different kind of lifestyle. It's one that I, after experiencing it for a couple of years, decided that it was not for me. I had worked in restaurants doing many different things. One being a poor boy joint on the Gulf Coast, frying everything from oysters to redfish all day long to make poor boy sandwiches. Anybody know what a poor boy sandwich is here? Okay, use a special kind of bread. It's kind of like a real crispy bread, and they're originally from New Orleans, but you can get them all over the Gulf Coast. And I would come home every day smelling like a vat of grease. So it's also usually very hot in the kitchen. I mean, like very, very hot. It's not, as I said, the most pleasant working environment. He decides to continue on in this. Mario Batali, it was pretty well known that Mario would not give you a letter of recommendation for another job if you did not stay at Babot for longer than a year. You had to be there at least a year for him to give you a job recommendation. And most of the people in the restaurant are, I would say, the higher ups, like the sous chef, the assistant sous chef, the prep manager. They're all probably looking to one day open their own restaurants, and this was kind of a proving ground for them. It also behooved them to be around someone with a good business sense like Mario Batali. But for the most part, Mario is not around. He's not at the restaurant. He pops in every once in a while. The restaurant, and this is the case of a lot of places in New York City, maybe not just New York City, probably in a lot of the United States. The labor is usually people from Latin America, the people who do all the dirty work, the people who are the dishwashers, the people who come in at 7 o'clock in the morning and start prepping the food. It's going to be prepared in the restaurant that night, and they never even see what the end result is. I mean, they're kind of the glue that holds the business together. And this is kind of something that is starting to be talked more about in the restaurant industry, especially in New York. About a month or so ago, there was a big article about Daniel Boulud, about some of his help had kind of gotten fed up because they kept being passed over for promotions, and they were mainly people from Latin America, Mexico, Central America, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic. And they're starting to realize that this is not right, and they need to be able to say something, and they have started to bring lawsuits against these huge restaurant empires that have just kind of pushed them in the background for years and years and years. So he does touch on this too, on how, I mean, most of the management, I should say, don't even call these people by their names. I mean, they're just referred to as the Latins. So that's a part of the business that, you know, a lot of people don't know about. This is a real insider's view of how a big city kitchen works. And if you're at all interested in the goings on and the politics and the egos, I mean, it's incredible. The apprentice that he becomes to this Dante-Quoting butcher in Tuscany is probably one of the most besides Mario Batali, one of the most colorful characters in the book, and his ego is just incredible. And I actually, we have a little restaurant in the village where I live in Rensselaerville. It's called the Palmer House. And 2 or 3 years ago, there was a young woman who had graduated from Johnson & Wales in Providence, Rhode Island, had kind of been working with the chef owner of the Palmer House, and he had approached me and said, you know, you've got to talk to Nicole. She needs to go to Europe and do an apprenticeship in Europe, and if you can help us do this, I would really appreciate it. Well, as it turns out, she ended up going to Italy, and she actually did Apprentice with the same butcher that's in this book, Dario Caccini. And I remember talking to her on the phone a couple of times when she would call the Palmer House and talk to her protege, talk to her mentor, Bill Benson, who now is cooking at the Crooked Lake House over in Averill Park. Yeah. And I might happen to be there, and he's like, oh, you got to talk to Cynthia and tell her, you know, and so I would get on the phone, and of course, she couldn't talk long. She was calling long distance from Italy, and she started telling me about this crazy man that she was working for. She goes, you wouldn't believe it. He goes, he throws people out of his shop. If they come in and ask for something that he thinks is ridiculous, he just tells them to leave. You know, and I was like, wow, you know, I mean, it sounds pretty interesting. And one thing that Bill Buford touches on again and again in this book, because the more he's around this kitchen environment, the more he realizes that cooks are nutty. And he, you know, he's like, they're just kind of a little off kilter, you know, and I guess you kind of have to be to work in that environment, you know. But he also touches on the fact that it's also, which a lot of people I don't believe, well, maybe they do, but for the most part, don't realize what a creative aspect is in the kitchen. I mean, you have to be creative. I mean, you have to, because what Mario did with his recipes that are served in restaurants like Babbo and Lupa and Otto, or he takes, you know, the basic Italian ingredients, and then he kind of just puts his little spin on them. I mean, some of them are really pure traditional recipes that he got when he was apprenticing in Italy, but there's a very creative aspect to it, you know. So that was another thing that Bill Buford kept talking about. He said they're nutty and they're creative, and I'm proud to be in that group of people. So, but Dario is this butcher in Tuscany, in this little tiny town outside. It's in Chianti, in the region of Chianti. And has anyone ever been to Chianti, to that part of Italy? Yes, yes, lovely. Not my favorite part, but it is lovely. He had heard about Dario. Mario Batali's father was an executive for Boeing in Seattle, Washington. That was his career for 25 years. That's what he did. And he helped get airplane parts that were manufactured in these plants it cost a lot less for them to be manufactured in Italy and Spain than in the United States. So he would be traveling to Italy and Spain a lot to make sure these parts were being manufactured the way they should be and to be shipped back to Seattle, Washington to be put in airplanes that Boeing was building. Now, his name is Armandino, and his parents were Italian immigrants, and they opened the first Italian import store in the state of Washington in the early 1900s, 1920s, I believe. So Armandino started feeling guilty when his parents died and they ended up selling that Italian import business. He decided he'd had enough. He'd worked at Boeing for 25 years. He was going to go back to Italy and study how to make salami. Because when his father died, all of the secrets of the family recipes and everything died with him. So where did he go to study how to make salami? He went to study with Dario Caccini, this crazy madman in this tiny little town in Chianti. So Mario had never actually studied with Dario, but his dad had, Armandino. And I don't know if any of you have ever had, Armandino now has a restaurant / store in Seattle, and it's called Salumi. Has anyone ever been there or tasted? If you get a chance, if you ever see any of his products, like if you're in New York City and they have it at Murray's Cheese or someplace like that, get it. It is divine. I mean, it takes you back to Italy when you taste it. It's so wonderful, and it's very, it's such a wonderful product, and it's one of those things that you can feel the love and the passion that was put into it when it was made. So if you have a chance, definitely try some of Armandino Batali's salami. I think you can even order it online. Not sure. So go home and Google Armandino Batali's store. Anyway, so Dario, okay, is this character, and so when Bill Buford decides, okay, I'm going to go learn how to make pasta with this woman that Mario Batali learned how to make pasta with. I'll go do that. And that is a wonderful part of the book where he learns how to roll it out by hand, and you have to get it so thin that you can see the wood grain underneath the pasta on the table, and has this different kind of like rolling pin. It's this Italian kind of baseball bat looking thing that they use specifically to roll out the pasta. He decides that he wants to learn after he's mastered the pasta, and he was there for 6 months learning how to make pasta. He goes back, works at the New Yorker a little bit, and then decides he's going to come back to, he really wants to move to Italy full-time now and learn how to be a butcher from this madman from Chianti. And that's when his wife is kind of like going, thought you already knew how to make pasta. So this is one of my favorite passages in the book, when he actually talks his wife, Jessica, into going to Chianti with him. And he had heard about Dario, as I said, through Armandino, Mario's father, but he was also had made a name for himself. He was written about as kind of with things like, you know, the most famous butcher in Italy. Alice Waters brought him to California for the big party they had for Julia Child for her 80th birthday at Berkeley, and she brought Dario with him, and so there was all kinds of stories about him in the U.S. press when Dario first came here with Alice Waters. So I'm going to read you this. This is when he has Faith Willinger, who is an American that lives in Florence. She's a wonderful food writer. She got him in touch with Dario because her and Dario are kind of friends. So he kind of tells her what to say, like he wants to learn how to be a Tuscan butcher, and they have this crazy exchange over the phone, and Dario's girlfriend at the time is American, so she got on the phone and said, okay, he really did say you can come and study with him. So here's a passage from when Bill Buford arrives in Chianti and finds the little town of Panzano, which is where Dario's butcher shop is. Dario's butcher shop, the Macelleria, was on a steep street next to the post office. Actually, it was two shops joined together. The lower one was like a family sitting room, or more precisely, the sitting room of a family that lives with its animals. There was a dining table with chairs, a bookcase, a bust of Dante, and a ceramic fountain, the kind cows drink water from. There were also a mincing set of black spikes entitled Welcome to Tuscany, and a papier-mâché depiction of something, of people, I'd discover, life-size, disappearing into the flames of hell. The upper shop, where the wares were displayed, was impossible to get into. There was a crush of people. Inside, in the doorway, on the sidewalk, spilling into the street. How many? 100? More? They were sweaty and excited. I stood on my tiptoes. Someone had a television camera on his shoulder. There were flashing light bulbs. I could hear loud choral music of what I thought might be Mozart's Requiem. Why a Requiem? Then again, it's a butcher shop. Why not a Requiem? I pushed my way in. Everyone seemed to be holding a glass of red wine in one hand and feeding themselves gobs of frothy white cream with the other. Lardo, a man said, offering me some. Lardo crudo. Raw, not cured. It was spread across his cheeks like toothpaste. I pressed forward. A man in a suit was swinging a fiasco of red wine, straw-covered, like one of those bottles you see in really bad restaurants and learn never to drink. He tried to pour me a glass but missed, and the wine landed on my shoes. It wasn't 11 o'clock in the morning, but an energetic, raucous tipsiness was everywhere. You smelled it. It elbowed you. It laughed harshly in your face. Behind a glass display of meats, salumi, and sausages was the butcher. Standing on a platform, towering over the room, oblivious to the people below him, who were clamoring and giving him things, orders, money, paper for an autograph. He ignored them. He too was drinking wine, quite a lot. It seemed, because he had a happy half grin on his face. The music was very loud. Deis ira, deis illa, days of wrath, days of doom, and people were shouting to be heard. In one hand, the butcher held a shiny, serrated knife, more military saber than a butcher's tool. He was tall, over 6 feet. At the time, I thought he must be 6.5 feet, but that was the effect of the platform, which made him seem comic book tall, like a cartoon caveman. His hands were gigantic. They might have been the largest hands I'd seen in my life. They were way out of proportion with the rest of his body. They looked as if they might have been half the length of his arms. The fingers were incredibly long, like limbs. He was wearing pink clogs and socks, a pink bandana around his throat, and a pink cotton shirt. Taut, almost ill-fitting over the shoulders, which were large and overdeveloped, giving him a hunched-back appearance. His hair was cropped, closely cut to the side of the head, crew-cut style, and he had big eyebrows, a big nose, and big lips. A face of big features. He was in his late 40s, my age. So, this is Dario Caccini, I thought, and he spotted me spotting him. He turned off the music and commanded silence. The place went quiet. Nel mezzo del cammin del nostra vita, he boomed, mi ritrovi vi una selva oscura, ce la detira via ismerita. Of course, he has no idea what he's saying to him. Even I finally recognized that this was the beginning of Dante's Inferno. Midway through the road of life, I find myself in a dark wood on a lost road. Midway through my life, indeed. Is that where I was? Lost on a road to hell? It started to rain, and more people crushed inside, pushing hard to get out of the wet. Dario continued, or maybe he'd embarked on something new. Whatever it was being said with great gusto. His eyes were veined and red, and his pupils were dilated. I could observe them because he jumped off the platform, seized me by the shoulders, and inches from my face was spraying me with saliva foamy verse. He seemed to be declaiming rhyming couplets, very sing-songy. One was shouted, the next was whispered. He crouched low as though trying to take his audience by surprise. Then he thrust himself upright as though making an announcement. He made his eyes big. He made them small. He wagged his finger. He brought his hands together in prayer. I've never seen such a melodramatic reading. Someone was now playing a fiddle. It called for gaslights and Victorian top hats. This was what Dickens must have sounded like. Frankly, it seemed ridiculous, but the room loved it. And when Dario stopped and bounced back to the platform, the audience, in a high metabolic euphoria, the drink, the raw fat, the hot closed space, the privilege of being in it, erupted in uproarious vaudeville applause, which Dario acknowledged. Waving a hand in the air, he jettisoned the Mozart CD, turned up the volume, and popped in a salsa-sounding Italian number. Festa, he shouted, gyrating on the podium. Festa, festa, festa. He spun and came back in another direction. Festa, festa, festa. I was to report to work the next morning at 8. So Dario Caccini, as you can see, is that was Bill Buford's welcome to Chianti when he first got there. One more very important point that I'd like to bring up about another, how shall I call it, something that Bill, again, discovered that I don't think most of these things in the book, I don't believe he set out to discover. These were things that just naturally occurred and came to him in the process. He realized that some of the foods that he was working with in Italy were disappearing. Some of the old ways of not only raising the animals and pressing the olive oil and raising the grapes for the wine, a lot of them were being lost. And there was a kind of a new generation trying to bring back some of these traditions. And he brings up a really important point that I think is one of the reasons that I'm still so passionate about what I do and why I like to take people on these food-focused tours now, because there's so many traditions that are being lost in this high-tech, mass-produced world that we are plummeting in, hurling through space in. I like to point out to people that, when we go to Sicily, this cheese, here's a cheese, I want you to taste this. This has been made the same way, by the same type of cow, aged in the same type of reed basket for 1,000 years. There's so much history in some of these foods that Bill Buford talks about when he's in Italy. And to me, that's so important to continue and to carry on this tradition. A very quick passage that he says it so well, I feel like I have to read it, and I hope that you enjoy it as much as I did. Italians have a word, casalinga, which means homemade. Although its primary sense is made by hand, my theory is just a variant of casalinga. Small food by hand and therefore precious, hard to find. Big food from a factory and therefore cheap and abundant. Just about every preparation I learned in Italy was handmade and involved my learning how to use my own hands differently. My hands were trained to roll out dough, to use a knife to break down a thigh bone, to make sausage or lardo or polpetti. So, with some techniques, I had to make my hands small, like Betta, the woman who taught me to make pasta. With others, I made them big, like the maestros. The hands, Dario says, are everything. With them, cooks express themselves like artists. With them, they make food that people use their hands to eat. To me, food always tastes better that you eat with your hands, no matter what it is. With the hands, Dario passes on to me what he learned from his father. With the hands Beta gives me her aunts, the hands of Miriam's mother, her grandmothers, the hands of Dario's grandfather, the great-great-grandfather he never met, except indirectly, in what was passed on through his hands. Miriam, who can't get a pastina, which is a woman who rolls, a local woman in the village who rolls out dough. It's called a pastina. Miriam, who can't get a pastina to roll out the dough, no longer makes handmade pasta. When her daughter takes over, will she roll it out by hand? In Tuscany, you can't get the meat at the heart of the region's cooking. So Dario and the maestro found a small farm that reproduces the intensity of flavor they grew up with. How long will that taste memory last? The maestro will die. Dario will die. I will die. The memory will die. Food made by hand is an act of defiance and runs contrary to everything in our modernity. Find it. Eat it. It will go. It has been around for millennia. Now it's evanescent, like a season. So this message to me is one of the most important ones in the book. If you can find food that has been raised or made with care and has been passed on, a tradition passed down, by all means experience it. Find it and eat it, as he says, and try to keep it alive. Dario, I love his description of Dario's hands when he was talking about how big they were. And when my husband and I, who will celebrate our 7th wedding anniversary this June, we eloped and got married in Italy. And we were staying in a little farmhouse that was on the Umbrian-Tuscany border. And our farmhouse was actually in Umbria, but we would go down to the village store to buy groceries, and it was in Tuscany. And it was Marcello was the man who ran the little market there. And I'll never forget when I walked in to buy some milk and bread and juice and cheese, of course, and some salami. I was asking about the different cheeses, and in that region, Pecorino is the local cheese, and they had everything from a very young Pecorino that had been made, yesterday, to a wheel that was about this big that had been aged for 2 years. So I asked Marcello if I could have a taste of the one from the wheel. So he goes in, and I notice his hands. His hands, I guess the best way I can describe them, were like hams. He had hands like hams. They were huge. Marcello was huge. He was towered over me. So he goes down, he reaches down into the case where all the cheeses are laid out, and he grabs this wheel, which must have weighed 30 or 40 pounds. It was like this. And he grabs it, and he gets it with these hams of hands, and he takes it and he pushes it up to his nose, and he goes, and that says it all right there. I mean, this man was so happy to be smelling that cheese and holding it in his hand, and his neighbor down on the next farm over had made it. I mean, it's just so wonderful to experience things like that. And if you think you would enjoy experiencing things like that, then you need to read Heat. Thank you very much. Do you have any questions? Yes.
Well, I want to ask you something really that doesn't have to do with the book, but I want to say that I enjoyed your review of the book.
Thank you.
But there was controversy maybe a year or so ago that the portions of food in good restaurants was much too big and people were protesting. I feel just the opposite. I feel like I go in, they're little dinky portions. What do you feel about that?
Well, it depends on the restaurant, are we talking high-end restaurants here, or are we talking like your down and dirty red sauce Italian joint?
No, we're talking good restaurants. I probably haven't been to the most fabulous, famous ones you've been to, but good 4-star restaurants. Yeah. You know, a small medallion of meat or something. I mean, I don't know.
Right. You know, that's a real. There is a huge controversy about that. I mean, I think for the most part, I think portions in this country are huge, way huge. The style that you're speaking of is more European, because if you've been to Italy or France, and you know that you have like 4 or 5 courses at lunch, but the servings are so small that you can, you know, you get to taste a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and it's just so enjoyable when you don't have to waddle out of the restaurant in pain.
I want to ask you too about bread being served with meals. I've been to some nice restaurants, the food is very good, and the bread is very lackluster. It's just like room temperature, just ordinary, maybe even stale almost.
Yeah.
Do you find that?
That's a bad sign. That's a bad sign.
It's almost an afterthought, you know?
Yeah. To me, bread is one of the best ways to find out about a restaurant before your food gets there. If a restaurant cares about the bread and that it's made well and made that is not stale, you know, like a European style whole grain type bread, or maybe, I love it when they bring out a basket and there's 2 or 3 different kinds of bread in the basket, and you can choose what kind you would like. You know, bread is a very telling indicator of what's going on in the kitchen.
Sometimes the rest of the meal can be very good,
but the bread is awful.
Nothing.
You know, and I got to encourage people to say something. Like, you know, whenever, my poor family, I got to tell you, you know, whenever we go out to eat, and if something's not right, I feel like it's my responsibility, and I'm not ever rude. I just say, excuse me. I said, but you know, the bread is stale or whatever.
Good.
You know, like, I just want to let you know that, because you don't want to be serving this to people, and I would appreciate it if you would bring me some that's not stale. You know, whatever. Or my soup is cold. Or, you know, I mean, you're paying good money for this. I mean, you should say something. You don't have to be mean. You can just say, you know, you want to taste this and make sure you think it's okay, you know. But my poor family, I mean, you know, they're like, Mother, please shut up. Yes. But like I said, if it was my restaurant, I would want someone to tell me. You know, so.
It's so good to hear you say that, because often I go out with people and we pick apart the food. Oh, it's this, it's that, you know, and then the waitress or waiter will come and say, "How's the food?" Everybody says, "Oh, it's great." Well, they're not going to learn anything from that. One other thing I want to ask you about, and then I'll give other people a chance. You mentioned how the kitchens are usually hot, and yeah, I've been in them, and they're boiling hot. Why don't they have like major air conditioning in there so that the people can be more comfortable while they're working and performing their job?
Well, then the food will get cold.
Oh.
You know, usually the cold station or the salad station or the pantry or whatever you want to call it, that's usually kind of over there. It's not near the grill, you know, so, and they usually have a refrigerator there to keep stuff cold. But maybe you know, like they don't want the food they don't want it to be room temperature. They want it to be hot when it goes over the pass and out the door in the waiter's hand. So, you know. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
You're really delightful. And I'm not going to say one thing about food, but tonight I'm going to a meeting here. It's going to be on evolution or intelligent design, and you've settled it for me. Because you've given me insights into both. I don't have to make a decision anymore. You used the word design, and I knew I was for intelligent design. And then when you told us all about the changes, I knew that there was evolution. So I thank you. It's been a wonderful, wonderful day.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much. I do have some like brochures in the back about my some of my culinary travel that's coming up. My website is being built. It's under construction as we speak. But I have a phone number on there and I have an email address. So if you're interested in going to meet some of these wonderful food producers that I think that are doing very, very important work, cheesemakers, winemakers, bread bakers, chefs, come with us. We always have a great time and it's a lot of fun, and the brochures are back there, and thank you all so much for coming today. Thank you.